Good morning or afternoon, depending where you're joining us from today. I'm Bill Pitkin, a Senior Policy Fellow at the Urban Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this session on opportunities and challenges for housing decommodification today. We're excited to have over 500 people from across the country registered for this event and to have a panel of 3 leaders from across the country to share what they're doing to advance housing justice. First, a few housekeeping details. Today's event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterward. You can hide captions or adjust settings with the live transcript button in Zoom. All participants are muted, but we want to hear from you. So please type your questions or comments into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll be monitoring those for the discussion session later in our session today. We'd like your feedback on today's event. So please take a couple minutes to complete the survey at the end of the event that will be shared in the chat. And lastly, engage with us online using the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. Okay, now let's get into the substance of today's discussion. To provide some context, here is an overview of the Housing Justice Project at the Urban Institute. Rising housing insecurity, particularly for Black, Indigenous, and Latinx residents who've faced long-standing discriminatory policies and practices in housing and related sectors, has led to a growing number of advocates, organizers, and policymakers and researchers to call for a structural overhaul of the country's housing system. Many of them are calling for housing justice. Through the Housing Justice Project, we are working to better understand this movement by drawing on Urban's expertise in housing research and policy, racial equity and analytics, and strategic advising on cross-sector housing solutions. In our recently released Building a Housing Justice Framework report, we highlight 8 principles of housing justice, shown in the blue section of the illustration on this slide, ranging from housing is a human right to self-determination and reparations. And we offer this definition of housing justice: ensuring everyone has affordable housing that promotes health, well-being, and upward mobility by confronting historical and ongoing harms and disparities caused by structural racism and other systems of oppression. As a nonprofit research organization, Urban Institute's role in housing justice is threefold: to build and amplify knowledge related to housing justice, to develop evidence-based tools to advance housing justice, and as we are doing today, to convene and engage stakeholders. Here are a few examples of how we're carrying out those roles. Listed here are several recent publications from the Housing Justice Project, including the first one on decommodification, which is the subject of today's event. In addition, we've published a second edition of our Housing Justice Framework, as well as research on disability justice and the connection of historical forms of housing discrimination to current conditions. Links to those publications are in the resources section of the Housing Justice Hub. Looking ahead, we have 3 publications in process and that are scheduled to be released in the coming months. This spring, we'll release a guide with examples of interventions, policies, programs to advance housing justice across several domains, from increasing housing supply, housing and household and community protections, homelessness, community power building, and opportunity and wealth. In late summer, we'll be publishing research on community organizing and power building for housing justice, focusing on efforts in Los Angeles. And in the fall, we will release an analysis of racial equity among women who are homeless. We look forward to sharing and engaging with you on these publications as well. The research brief, Decommodification and its Role in Advancing Housing Justice, was co-authored by Samantha Fu and Gabby Velasco, who both work in the Research to Action Lab at Urban. I'm now going to invite Gabby to provide an overview of the research before we hear from our panel.
Thanks, Bill. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Gabby Velasco, and I'm a policy analyst in Urban's Research to Action Lab. Before jumping into our panel, I'm going to provide a quick overview of the work we've done in the Hub, exploring why decommodification needs to be a central focus for housing justice, and also provide some shared terms and definitions for our discussion. So before talking about decommodification, we first need to touch base on what we're addressing: commodification. Commodification is the process by which an object's economic value comes to dominate its other uses. In the case of housing, commodification made the protection of housing values and markets the priority, rather than the ethical or material use of housing as shelter and as a vital component of individual and community health, economic mobility, and well-being. Our research shows that the acceleration of commodification in recent decades is a key driver of housing instability, particularly for people of color, renters, and people with low incomes. Some of the key ways commodification has shaped mainstream US housing policy include the mass disinvestment in public housing and shifts in federal funding towards public-private partnerships like vouchers and tax incentives. Another way is by isolating homeownership as the primary means of wealth building, forcing homeowners to rely on the continued appreciation of their homes to build wealth and achieve security. And also the incredible rise of speculative real estate that the federal government enabled through tax breaks and deregulation. So there's a lot of research detailing how commodification has perpetuated housing injustice and housing insecurity. But at the core of all this work is the basic premise that in order to create portions of the housing market that benefit from economic excess, that value has to be extracted from some other portion of the market. The power imbalances that inform this extraction are the same ones that exist in all structures and systems in the United States, making policies that promote commodification part and parcel of structural racism. Prioritizing housing as a commodity amounts to a deliberate disregard of the legacy of racist public policies and private practices that have created poor housing outcomes for Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities in particular. Housing justice works to ensure safe and stable housing for all, and policies that focus on the actions and economic desires of developers, investors, and landlords aren't designed to do that. Now we arrive to the topic of today's webinar, decommodification. For us, decommodification refers to actions that remove housing stock from the private market to reduce the impact of speculation on housing access, work to ensure permanent affordability, and when coupled with measures that focus on tenant rights, protect residents from displacement and disempowerment. Decommodified housing models can be broadly put into two categories. The first is public and social housing. Most of you are probably familiar with the US model of public housing made available to families with low incomes. And social housing can take a lot of forms and is often designed for mixed income communities, but must be non-speculative, democratically run, and publicly funded. And the second bucket is shared equity models like community land trusts, which are governed by residents that hold and steward land through an independent structure so that it's affordable in perpetuity. Another example are limited equity cooperatives, where residents purchase shares in the collective development, like an apartment building, and share ownership. Deed-restricted housing, which caps things like resale price and purchaser income, is another means to protect long-form affordability. In recent years, there's been a lot of exciting action towards local and state governments supporting public, social, and shared equity models, building on decades of community and tenant organizing. It's also important to note that public, social, and shared equity models aren't the only strategies to achieve housing justice. We also see decommodification as a tool and a framework to help design and implement new policies, programs, and investments in a way that mitigates ongoing harm, does not further bolster commodification, and builds towards long-term systems change. Because of the lack of large-scale investment in decommodified models to date, a lot of questions remain, like how much of the housing stock needs to be decommodified to achieve housing justice goals? How can we accomplish that scale? And how should that housing be built, operated, and governed? We invite you to learn more about decommodification in our brief, and we're so excited for our panelists to share their insights on these questions and more shortly. I'd now like to turn it over to Danielle DeRuiter-Williams to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Gabby. I'm extremely excited to bring our panelists together today to hold space for this conversation. As a former urban planner in the Department of Planning in San Francisco, the context of housing insecurity and stability is really near and dear to my heart, my professional heart, my personal heart. I am one of the co-leads on our housing justice project at the Urban Institute. As Gabby said, my name is Danielle DeRuyter-Williams, and I'm Associate Director of Racial Equity in the Research to Action Lab. So central to this conversation and so central to our work around housing justice is ensuring that we are taking a lens around racial equity to our work. It's one of the core tenets of our definition and of our pillars of housing justice. And so I want to kick us off with one of the key questions of equity and racial equity in this work, which is, who do we find is burdened and who benefits from our current system of commodified housing? And so I'd like to invite Emily to kick us off by introducing yourself, a little bit about your organization, and from your perspective, who benefits and who's burdened by our current system?
Thanks, Danielle. I'm very honored to be here today, and I really appreciated the invitation. And I'm just so excited to hear from the other presenters as well today and learn from them. So I'm Emily Faden. I'm the Vice President of National Strategy for Grounded Solutions Network. We are a national nonprofit membership organization that supports communities, nonprofits, and community land trusts, local governments to create and preserve housing with lasting affordability to advance racial and economic equity. I think Gabby did such a good job reviewing this, but the commodification and financialization of our real estate is alive and well, right? The proliferation of things like the single family rental industry or the emergence of fintech companies that are trying to find ways to make homeowners' equity more liquid so that it can be borrowed against, right? Like, these commodifications are extracting money from people of color and low and moderate income earners to yield returns for the wealthy and big companies. And the outcome of this, right, is that neighbors and community members literally have less ownership and equity in their neighborhoods because it's owned by investors who have no ties to that place. And so really, if we can grow a larger segment of social and collective housing, we would be bringing that sense of ownership back to neighbors, to the block, to the place, and ensuring that some of these investments we are making are actually being rooted locally to the benefit of the community.
Thanks so much. Damien, I'd love if you could introduce yourself and speak to the first question as well.
Well, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Damien Goodman, and I have the good pleasure of being one of the founders and the Secretary Treasurer of Liberty Community Land Trust, which is based in the Crenshaw community of Los Angeles. Crenshaw, like so many areas, urban areas, particularly along coastal America, is undergoing significant disruption as the creative class and with it, speculative investors matched with this digitization, the fintech of real estate, that has led to an increased housing unaffordability, insecurity, and a unhoused population that is the largest in America. In 2019, we evolved from the Crenshaw Subway Coalition, which is an advocacy-focused organization based on environmental justice, transit justice, land use policy, and said that we needed to actually be on the field. We need to be about taking land off the speculative market, because we saw the erasure of Black people in Los Angeles. Our goal as the Community Land Trust is pretty ambitious. We anticipate and seek to become the largest community land trust in America by the end of this decade. And that is because that is what is required for us to stabilize Black communities. So much of the work that we are doing and so many of the leaders that we have the pleasure of working with go back decades in this fight for self-determination. They've felt the vestiges of redlining. They've been denied home loans despite having the same income and credit scores that whites who applied to the same bank were provided. They're engaged right now, and they are in reverse mortgages. And so as we talk about decommodification of housing, we talk about making housing a human right, we're really talking about addressing systemic inequality in America in its most blatant form, seen on our streets in in the unhoused population. And we're seeing and seeking to do through the work that we're doing, seeing this transfer of power among those who have always had resources to those who have always been locked out. How do we create stabilized communities? How do we think collectively and not individually? How do we lead to a more just society that is equitable and allows those who have been regularly pushed around to have space and to have claim in this American experience?
Thank you, Damien. Those are a lot of the biggest questions we should be asking. Margaret, I'd love to pass it over to you for you to introduce yourself and answer the first question.
Certainly, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Margaret Donnelly Moran. I'm the Deputy Executive Director for Development for the Cambridge Housing Authority. Cambridge Housing Authority was established in 1935, so we've been in the community for over 85 years. We are one of HUD's original moving to work agencies, which allows for some deregulation and an ability to respond to local conditions and by developing local programs and solutions. CHA operates in the city of Cambridge, which is well known with its universities and its tech and biotech areas. It's a very transit-rich, high opportunity community with proximity to jobs, healthcare, education, but it's also a very high cost market. The average home price is over $1 million, and rents go from anywhere from $2,600 for a 1-bedroom to $4,200 for a 3-bedroom, which actually exceeds the actual average income of the residents who live in Cambridge Housing Authority. So CHA owns approximately 3,000 units, all of which are deeply affordable, much of it acquired or built before 1985. So we're sitting on a portfolio that's 60, 70, 80 plus years old. We've only been able to add 300 units in the last 2 decades, which is really unfortunate given that the demand has increased well more than that. We have been fortunate over the last decade to really pursue opportunities to reinvest in our portfolio, basically protecting and preserving the deeply affordable units that we have in the city. And in doing so, we've also created some Faircloth Authority, which we'll talk about a little later, which allows the Housing Authority to actually expand federal public housing, which we're just starting to do right now. We also operate, in addition to owning units, 5,000 units of a voucher program, and that's the commodification of housing with the Section 8 program is alive and well, and a lot of private landlords really take advantage of that program in a way that isn't as beneficial to the residents it serve, and certainly does it at a pretty significant cost to a housing authority in terms of operating a program. You know, a public housing unit in Cambridge is funded at 1/3 of what a Section 8 voucher unit in Cambridge is funded to. And that disinvestment in public housing has really taken its toll. The amount of deferred maintenance and the quality and comfort of public housing has really diminished over the years with that lack of investment and the kind of the pivot towards the Section 8 model. We do house about 14,000 folks, about 12% of the city's population. And as I mentioned, most of our residents have incomes well below 15% of 15 to 30% of area median income, depending whether it's an elderly household or family, which is well below the average rent level. Just income alone is not enough. You can't even afford a rent, let alone the other basics and necessities. So the lack of resources certainly has impacted public housing and the residents that we serve. Put the portfolio at risk. I think Cambridge has done an incredible job over the last 10 years to really reset the button and extend the life of most of our portfolio for another 20, 30, or 40 years, but a lot of housing authorities are really behind in doing that and don't have the tools and resources to do it. In Cambridge, there's a real lack of mobility. You know, there's nothing in between public housing and very expensive market rate housing. So people are trapped. If they want to stay in their community and continue to benefit from all of the wonderful things that Cambridge has to offer, there's not a step up or out of public housing that keeps people in the community. You oftentimes see people moving, you know, half an hour to an hour away as they move out of public housing.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate how you layered in the other social conditions that really like flow from lack of affordable housing, lack of good quality, safe, healthy housing, the overlay of having to now commute and travel. If you have to move outside of the city, all of that is of tremendous importance. And we'll come back in a little bit to talk about the Faircloth Amendment and how you've still been able to increase some of that housing stock in light of that. But Damien, I wanted to jump over to you for a little bit. Gabby spoke earlier about some of the challenges of decommodifying housing at scale. And I'm really curious how you've been able to approach this in your work in Community Land Trust.
Absolutely. And the Liberty Community Land Trust, which was established in December of 2019, just in the last 18 months, we've acquired and taken off the speculative market 10 separate properties of different asset types. Some are commercial properties occupied by small Black businesses that definitely could not have paid the rent based on the amount of money that we paid. Others are vacant sites that are for future ground up light tech projects. Others are single family homes that we intend to convert into triplexes for low income home ownership using a recently created state law. Others are occupied multifamily sites that have tenants that would have been pushed out if the incoming landlords had been able to engage in the very unfortunate tactics that we see happening. And I wish I had a magical answer, but it's really very simple: cash. We engaged in 2020 in a historic campaign to acquire the Crenshaw Mall. We're a 40-acre site that was been the center of commerce for Black Los Angeles for generations, was up for sale, and we had the audacity of saying, instead of the speculators, instead of the CIM groups who were backed by public pension funds being able to acquire that asset, it should be under community control. And we raised a lot of money for that effort. Because people were looking for something that was impactful. They were looking for an urban village that sought to heal a community that underdone a lot of harm and not advance many of the things that we see taking place throughout America. Unfortunately, Deutsche Bank awarded the project to another entity that actually offered less money under less reasonable terms. And we're going to come back and get our mall. But in the interim, we decided that among the resources that we created, mostly philanthropic, but also social impact dollars, but mostly the philanthropic dollars we dedicate toward these acquisitions. We're able to match in the case of 8 of those acquisitions, speculators who are coming in with all cash offers. Similarly, many of them backed by the very institutional investors in the public pensions that were selling the Crenshaw Mall. And so when we've been able to do that and present similar offers, and actually when we get a chance in the case of the single family homes to talk to the homeowners who are selling, they love the idea of having someone come in, having an entity come in that wants to preserve the affordability of the area, maintain the cultural integrity of the community, and provide an opportunity for those that have historically been marginalized to grow and build families like they did. It'd be great if we had policy. I know we'll get to that a little bit more. We're advancing TOPA, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act here locally. That's a critical element in it. And we just need to be able to recognize that we live in a hyper-commodified market, and the rules for those who want to engage in this long-term preservation work, who want to engage in making marginalized people participants in these economies that are changing, that we have to be advantaged. That you can't create the same rules that a speculative investor can go in and purchase properties. They can't be given the same rules, given that they've got the financial advantage. We need better rules. We need protective policy that's in place. We need to make it more difficult for those who seek to flip our communities and increase housing insecurity. We need better rules in them, and we need to be able to check them.
Thank you so much. I'm also hearing in that one of the levers that you all utilized is like resources, right? Money. So that's one lever that we have to consider. And then there's also what policies or structures need to be changed or adapted to really be supportive of new ways of doing housing, right? Emily, I'd love to pass it to you, and then I'll come back over to you, Margaret. Emily, what are some of the federal, state, local policies that you think would be most supportive of creating sort of public or shared equity housing?
Well, I don't think I have anything new to say after Damien. We need the money, right? So on the federal level, and Margaret highlighted this too. I mean, we are woefully underfunding public housing and what it takes to maintain it. And we all know that creating a new affordable housing unit is far more expensive than preserving and keeping what we have. So I would say, we really need to double down as a country in public housing, but obviously recognizing we need to learn from the past and actually do that in a way that respects and is led by residents. Also, in the federal funding arena, there is not really a dedicated federal program to advance home ownership, let alone prioritizing advancing Black and Brown home ownership. And so I strongly believe that we need to advocate for a federal program that supports deeply affordable home ownership through shared equity models like co-ops and CLTs and resident-owned communities, and create that continuum, right? So once again, to Margaret's point, we need to have a continuum of housing to move people from public housing into affordable rentals and into home ownership. And then we are actually freeing up and serving more people with the affordable housing we have. The other thing I want to highlight is, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but if we are going to be investing in affordable housing, we have to be ensuring that it is permanent. We are spending so much money building affordable housing only to lose it. And so if we're really going to make a dent in this problem on the local, on the state, and on the federal level, we need to be advocating that if we're investing, it's permanent and we're keeping our public dollars invested in that housing. And then the last thing I would say, similar to what Damien was highlighting, is there's a lot that can be done on the state and local policy front. So tenant opportunity to purchase is huge, and we can go so much further faster in states and cities that have adopted those policies. But we also need to be really promoting inclusionary housing policies. So inclusionary zoning is a huge way to do that, or impact fees on new development, or bringing around zoning reform changes that are actually smartly designed to produce affordable housing, not just increase density in the luxury market. And there's some really interesting innovations, for instance, in Portland, Oregon, around that and how they're trying to unlock zoning reform for affordable housing.
Thank you. So we've got kind of money as a lever, we've got policy as a lever, we've got zoning, inclusive zoning, inclusionary zoning, tenants' right to purchase, right? Margaret, going back over to you, would love to hear, given the constraints that exist at the federal level to increase and expand public housing, curious how you all have been able to make some inroads, even if it's not as much as you would hope.
Right. I mean, I think we have been really focused on trying to use the tools that are available to accomplish our mission. And to, as long-term stewards of affordable housing institution, we're not going anywhere. We have a really robust resident participation commitment that we do, or as we say to our residents, we do our best work when they're actively engaged and involved, because they help make sure we do the right thing. And we have been fortunate in Cambridge over the years to have that robust resident participation. And some of it is just using some of the tools that you have. And as I mentioned earlier, we are an MTW agency, a moving to work agency, that gives us a little bit more flexibility than a normal housing authority. So one of the things we did in response to an alarming trend that saw all of our voucher holders basically starting to migrate to other communities because there were no affordable apartments that a landlord would rent to them in Cambridge, we started to project-base more and more of our vouchers, basically supporting ourselves and our affordable housing developers to actually underwrite affordable units in the city of Cambridge. So of our voucher program, almost 1,400 of the units are project-based, primarily with nonprofit affordable housing developers, and we've been able to either create or maintain those units as affordable with the city support. And in doing so, it's not only it's long-term affordability, talking 50 years or in perpetuity, which I think makes a huge difference. So that's a tool that a lot of housing authorities have that they just don't necessarily utilize. And again, as a moving to work agency, we were able to kind of supersize it and use it more. We've also established a sponsor-based voucher program where we have created a program that allows us to provide operating support to local service providers who can then provide shelter and supportive services to the folks that are hard to house individuals that we can't traditionally or easily reach with our traditional subsidized housing program. I think a third area where we really have made inroads is basically deciding over 20 years ago to serve as our own developer. So we have taken out any other private entity or role in the decision making. And so if there is, we get to push money down to the property and do a level of rehab that a private developer or even a nonprofit developer wouldn't necessarily do because their goals and objectives are different. And so this agency really doubled down and has really committed to developing the expertise and the staff capacity to basically be able to pursue the non-traditional public housing funding in a way that really protects the long-term affordability and commitment that we have with our residents. And we had to explain to our residents the whole concept of low-income housing tax credits and the whole concept of switching from public housing to the voucher program, and how putting a mortgage on the property is not a bad thing, but can be a good thing if it's done smartly and well. And then the other thing that we've been doing, and just a shout out to the city of Cambridge, they've given us a tool over the last couple of years in zoning called the Affordable Housing Overlay that basically allows 100% affordable projects to benefit from greater density and height than base zoning, which basically was intended to open the door for ourselves and other affordable housing developers in Cambridge to compete for property that we otherwise couldn't compete for, because a private developer might be able to put 4 units, we can put 12 units. And that math differential really has created opportunity. And then the last one I'll call out is just that all of our recapitalization efforts, and they've been substantial since 2010. We've closed on 18 LIHTC deals totaling $1 billion of financing just in the city of Cambridge. And as part of that repositioning and recapitalization efforts, we have used tools that HUD had available, but ended up creating Fair Cloth Authority for us. So we're sitting on the ability to create 1,500 new federal public housing units in the city of Cambridge, and possibly outside of the city of Cambridge, depending upon the partnerships we seek. And right now we are either in construction or we'll be starting construction shortly for 300 new units of housing just this year. And so, as I said, it took 20 years to do 300 units. We're doing 300 units this year, and we have another 400 to 500 units in our pipeline over the next 3 to 5 years. And that's been a tool. So it's like taking some of the tools that are there and maximizing them to our mission, to our goal, and to the betterment of the residents and the applicants that we serve.
Thank you so much. And it's great to hear that there's some momentum picking up. We know that, again, the need is so substantial that it will take a long time to catch up. But this sounds like it's headed in the right direction. I know this question isn't on the list that we had, but each of you referenced in different ways the importance of community engagement, community buy-in, residents being engaged throughout the work that you're doing. And I'm wondering if each of you could speak a little bit more to that, because we know that that's a really important component of not only housing, right, but also the communities that we're trying to build, and how do we ensure that we're knitting together and creating the sort of connectivity that we really want to see in our neighborhoods and our communities. And so, Damien, I'm wondering if you could share a bit more about the role of community that community plays. It's in your name of your organization, but the role that, remaining engaged and in right relationship with community means to you all, and how you see that as essential to this whole process.
Well, the most important word in community land trust is community, right? And we emphasize that point over and over again, and especially when talking about the communities that we're focused on, those that have been traditionally marginalized, Black, Indigenous people of color. And so much of the work that we're doing is regular engagement, regular seeking of what community wants. It's very interesting. I vividly recall when many of the people who were the leaders among the Liberty Community Land Trust and were basically giants in the space of community-driven development, ultimately said, I think we can actually do this. I think we can actually raise the money to buy the Crenshaw Mall. And one of the main things when we were having these massive meetings, 300, 400, in some cases 450 folks on Zoom during the pandemic, as we were envisioning the process and preparing for the vision of the process, is we would get the constant question from the community, what are you going to do with the mall? And we said over and over again, what would you like to see? This is not about us doing for, this is about us doing with. And it was a complete sea change in how people think about not just a 40-acre project, but a community as a whole, regardless of whether the project is one that is controlled by the community. And again, I've got to shout out Paul Yelder, since we've got Cambridge here, who was the first executive director of Dudley Neighbors, Inc., and the Dorchester, and the Roxbury community of Boston, who often would say the community land trust is simply a tool. It is a mechanism by which we're able to lift up and bring community together. We want people who are on land, not just because we have this ground lease agreement that restricts affordability, but we want them connected and engaged. We want them to see themselves as people whose voice and opinion is important, both for the land that is under community control and for the land that is not. And so when we're working from, and again, we just have tremendous privilege, and that we've got folks that go back to the 1960s Black Power movement. We're on the front lines in the aftermath of the '92 uprising in Los Angeles, advancing community ownership as a means for community revitalization in these strategies, who have been socialized, who have been educated about these for a while. And I have to say, and I know this isn't necessarily the question, but much of our challenges in socializing elected officials, in some cases, community development corporations, in many cases, especially the banking industry. The concept of collective ownership of land is not foreign to anyone. We all know what a condominium is. The concept of collective ownership of land that is owned by people who are low income, which exposes racial and income biases, is where they struggle. And so the number of partners, banking partners that we have that are really willing to open that conversation and build projects and get past those biases are few and far between. And that ultimately is largely our challenge, not working with the community, not preparing the community for ownership. Lord knows if a low-income person can be able to buy a home in my community where things go north of $800,000 as fixer-uppers and north of $1 million when they've been flipped, they will definitely take care of the land. It's about getting the public and getting the banks to believe that that's something that should be invested in.
Thank you so much. And building on that a little bit, Emily, I'm wondering, because some of that also seems like a tension between scale and community control. Can you speak at all to that tension and how we might look for ways to overcome that? Or is it a false tension altogether?
So my CEO, Tony Pickett, and I, we actually wrote an article exactly on this. And what we are claiming in the article is, I think that this is a straw man argument to say that scale and community control are trade-offs. They can absolutely go together, right? And I think that it's really the places where you see the most impact, I think, are those places that take a reconciled approach to those and understand that, land is power. Land is a finite resource. If you have it, you are increasing your community power, and people is power, right? So that community organizing, the community mobilization, that is the way to get your political will and your resources and your land, right? And that community is able to hold the organization that is, supporting collective control or stewardship accountable. So it's C and L, right? And they fit together really nicely. And the important part is to just make sure, I think, when scale is being advanced, that you don't lose the C, right? And that is something that we see, across the country. And, I think that a lot of our members are really proactively trying to think about how do we have to redefine, redeploy, re-engage communities as they scale the geography they serve. Right. And so there's a lot of creativity and I think a lot of really thoughtful intention going into that.
So there's an opportunity here to kind of dismantle or unpack what are these faux trade-offs that often show up in our conversations related to housing or any sort of social improvement or movement. And then there's also the very real connotation that public housing has had over the last several decades. I'm curious, Margaret, are there ways that you all are addressing or reframing this concept of public housing that has had such a negative connotation? How can we like work with that, move past it, change hearts and minds, push through resistance?
Well, I mean, the image behind me is public housing in Cambridge, so that's how you do it. Quality design, a robust process. That particular site was a 3-acre site, and we had because every 2-family around it was a condominium, we had 300 abutters. And the neighborhood process that we went in to get that building, and it was a tear down of an existing or a 1950s built set of buildings, replaced with new construction and some additional density. But the level of conversations that we had to have with the neighborhood and the commitment to a quality design in a thoughtful process, and not only with our neighbors, but with our own resident community, because there was fear where you're going to tear down that you're not going to replace, or the folks who are going to come are not going to have the opportunity to come back. And one of the things we have in Cambridge is a longstanding history of trust and a willingness to actually put into writing the things that need to be said. So it's not that I've got a good trust relationship and I've been here for a really long time, but you can count on the agency to deliver on the promise. And so, we've done time and time again when we've had relocation and disruption where the residents can come back and see, okay, everybody had that opportunity to come back. And from wherever they were, it could have been just from a unit from across the lot, from an old unit to a new unit, or from another CHA unit back. And I think that level of transparency, that level of commitment, that really level to really write it down so it can live and can be something that people can rely upon, I think is really key. And then I have to say, for the residents who stood up with us, with the neighborhood, when they wanted to push back on any number of different elements of the design, our neighbors don't make it easy for people of low income to feel comfortable in their own community. And the times of of people referring to them as, they're right in the room. And as I've had one resident say, it seems like trees are more important than I am, and where is my space in this community? I've been here for my entire life. I've raised my family here, and now I'm being told I don't have space here. And I think those are hard conversations that I really value our residents for being able to stand up and have their voice heard. And our job is to really support that effort, encourage that effort, engage that effort, and be respectful of that effort. And I think, as I said earlier, our best work comes from when we have a robust resident process, and we look for it every single time.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like you're really building on values of reciprocity and, again, being in kind of that right relationship and moving away from transactional connections with community. I'm also thinking about the way in which community can inform design of public housing. I live in New Orleans, and there are many challenges in New Orleans, but I will say some of the public housing that's gone up, it looks like the rest of the houses in the neighborhood. And New Orleans has very specific looking houses. And so it's been really cool to kind of see that integration with the design of a neighborhood. And I'm sure that that had something to do with the ways in which folks were being engaged throughout that process. I'm going to move us to our last question. I'm going to start with Emily. I'll kick it back to Margaret, and then Damien, I'd love for you to pick it up and close us out. I'm just really curious what your vision for a more equitable housing market looks like. What else do we need to do beyond decommodification? And what do you think are the most important efforts? So is it research? Is it policy? Is it something else that's needed to really support that vision?
Such a big question. I got a chance to just quickly scan some of the Q&A, and I think that a lot of the participants here are really hitting on it, which is If we can get to an equitable housing market, wonderful. And then, right, we have to be tackling things far beyond that, like access to transit, healthy food, education, healthcare, childcare, right? We need all of these things to come together. Because I think something that's really important to recognize, right, is if we actually, in fact, reach our vision for decommodifying housing for those who need it, then we still have more work to do to make sure that people are okay when they're older, right? If we are decommodifying housing and not making that the number one way that Black and brown and low income families build wealth, then we need to be filling in that wealth gap, right? And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done to be thinking about how do we promote economic mobility and equity as we are pursuing affordable housing and, you know, the pursuit of a more equitable housing market. And then I just want to flag one other thing that Damien lifted up, which is we still have so much structural racism in our housing finance system. And, you know, but for fixing that, we are going to continue to have inequitable outcomes and lack of access. And you said it so well, because there is a misassessment of risk taking place where there are winners and losers in this, and it is very, very biased in our systems. And that's something on an advocacy level I'm working on each and every day. But we really, really need to tackle those structural barriers.
Thank you. Margaret, what do we need to be thinking about in addition to decommodification?
I think programs that really support folks' ability to build assets. So, you know, we have a variety of programs that we partner with to help residents as they get more earned income to, you know, instead of having that income just go to an increase in rent, since rent is based on a percentage of income, to have some of that go towards building assets. And we've actually had residents who have moved through, not only have repaired their credit scores and put aside money, but put aside enough money to actually become a homeowner. And a homeowner, you know, without the affordability restrictions, so the potential of really, you know, allowing that family to build wealth, which I think has been one of the challenges in the home ownership program, particularly in Cambridge, is it's so costly to become a first-time home buyer in Cambridge. Even with the city's home ownership programs, the incentive for somebody to participate is really limited. As I mentioned earlier, I think creating the ladder and an opportunity for folks to move through and out of public housing, but still have some of the security and safety that public housing provides, I think is important. I think about how much we get on a per unit basis through the LIHTC program, you know, and it can be a couple of $100,000 per unit. And I think about that as a resource that if that same amount was made available for home ownership, as was mentioned, you know, that would be a game changer. And that could be money that, you know, would potentially recirculate and allow for future folks to benefit from home ownership as well. And, you know, I think there needs to be, you know, just an overall commitment to just all levels of affordability in communities. And I think we struggle in Cambridge where everybody's for affordable housing until it's in their neighborhood. And then everybody has all the reasons of why, yes, I'm still for affordable housing, but. And I think, you know, that talks about some of the systemic issues that we have around race and socioeconomic standards and all of that I think we really have to continue to strive to resolve and be better.
Thank you. Damien, go ahead and close us out.
It's a massive question. And I think about myself as a descendant of people who came to Los Angeles prior to the Great Migration. My family's been here for over 120 years, or almost 120 years, who were seeking, you know, an opportunity to own land, to build businesses, and they even created a bank back in the 1920s because the existing banks wouldn't provide mortgages to Black people. What their vision was and all of the struggle that they've gone through. I think about the struggle of the indigenous peoples, both there or within our urban areas and those across America. And I guess my vision for a more equitable housing market is one where speculators don't exist. And if they do, then they're so handcuffed that they can't engage in the disruptive tactics the wholesale disruptive tactics that they're engaged in. There's so many things that I think go to why we find community land trusts so critical to our work. And among them, especially when you look at our board of directors for the Liberty Community Land Trust and some of our most active members, we're believers in this collectivism. We don't believe in this individualistic, that it's okay for, Jay-Z to make a bunch of money while there's rampant Black unhoused population. We're not about this tokenism or this creating a more comfortable place for some within a parasitic, capitalistic, extractive market. And so where we're all able to, our goal is where we're all able to sit at a table, be them homeowners, be their leaseholders, renters, merchants, unhoused, and have our collectivism recognize our shared destiny identified, and to be in community, be in family, and be about healing one another. There's so much trauma we have, and I'll say specifically as Black people in America, that requires a healing, and it's hard to engage in any of these things without the security of home, without the security of income, the ability to create businesses and have them thrive and grow, and play and be among one another, create the social service net that is just having someone that you can call to pick up the kids, or someone checking on you to drop the food off when you're not feeling so great. And none of these goals, none of these values, none of these principles exist in a hyper commodified real estate market. They don't. And I worry, if I'm going a little bit deeper, about how things will evolve as climate catastrophe greatens. We've had a downpour, thankfully in Los Angeles, it's got a little bit better, but we've had a downpour that is pretty significant. We're dealing with wildfires. We're going to deal with significant levels of mass migration that's a product of simply the increase in getting beyond the 1.5 Celsius. We're way beyond that, right? And so as that happens, and as AI and automation expands, reducing the number of jobs, how are we going to respond? Are we going to do the Donald Trump and fight with one another, or we're going to go back to those principles of collectivism, those principles of shared challenge and shared prosperity, that desire to benefit? Some of the greatest things that we saw during the days of the pandemic, the mutual aid and seeing in one another. And so, yeah, I know it's a big question, and one could write an entire thesis on it. But it ultimately is one where, frankly, these investment dollars, these public pension dollars, are not going toward extraction and exploitation. They're going towards stabilization. They're going toward reparative, regenerative, restorative economies and healing, not harm.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. With the mic drop, just to put a point on things, and then I'll hand it over to Sam to get some Q&A from our audience. It sounds to me like some of the big questions we should be asking is not like what we can do given these current structures and systems, but what we must do to create the sort of communities that are collective, that are reciprocal, that are transformative, that we want to achieve. And really appreciate all of your contributions today. Sam, I'll hand it over to you. I know we have a very active Q&A box.
Yes, thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Emily, Damien, and Margaret, for an incredibly thought-provoking discussion. Thus far, we've gotten tons of excellent questions from our audience, so I'm just going to dive right in. The first one is about the tension between wanting to serve people of lower incomes and people of color with public and shared equity housing models, and the fact that those models provide more limited wealth building opportunities compared to traditional homeownership. So how do we move towards decommodification and work towards closing the racial wealth gap at the same time? And how do we bring community members into those conversations when they have been impacted by capitalism and are interested in wealth building? I know we're starting with the easy one.
Well, I know that one of the main elements of community land trust is that first off, we're now in a world, especially in the context of Crenshaw, where low income and even moderate income housing is not even a possibility. So this conversation 20 years ago was significantly different than it is today. The entry point and having that shared equity model with the community and that agreement that when the home is sold in the context of community land trust, that it's going to be sold to another lower moderate income family. That might have been difficult when the houses were $150,000. It's not so difficult when we're talking about the option is you're renting, you find a way to marry rich to get the $1.1 million house, or you're in a community land trust. But I think just in general, that what you find is that leaseholders in CLT land, they're more apt because they're not spending as much money on housing to move into that traditional market. They're better equipped. And so if we're able to find that stability, we're able to have folks who are only spending 25 or 30% of their income in their housing costs, and they're better equipped to enter the market. And if they're able to not worry about those things, just in general, that they're able to address their health concerns. But lastly, and I'll make this point, like, we've got to get back to talking to people about values. It wasn't that long ago that people were buying a home because they wanted to be in a community and and the schools were good. The concept of a home increasing in value by 5 times in 20 years was unimaginable. So what is the value of having a home? What is the value of being in community? Isn't that more than this paper value that's only frankly realized when you die and your kids, if your kids sell, right? So I think we're in that process of talking about shared values and collectivism and being real about the state of the condition of the housing market now.
Emily, Margaret, anything to add?
One thing that I like to talk about in this moment is I think that we have this misconception of homeownership generally. Like, we have this very white, affluent assumption about how homeownership works. And in reality, that is not how it works for low income and people of color. 1 out of 2, a longitudinal study done by Reed, 1 out of 2 first-time low income and people of color home buyers were not able to sustain home ownership for 5 years. And when you look at the data, when you buy low-cost housing, you are actually building your wealth from paying down your principal. So the longer you stay, the more wealth. So I feel like that really what shared equity homeownership is about doing homeownership differently. It should not be a coin toss if you succeed, right? And so making the payment more affordable, having that ongoing support from your community and the nonprofit steward. This is how we can actually transform homeownership. And now when we look at the data, over 90% of homeowners in shared equity homes sustain homeownership for 5 years, and they're not leaving because of delinquencies or foreclosures, right? And that's what we're seeing in the private market. So I think it's about delivering homeownership differently in a transformational way that is actually working for the people you're trying to serve.
And Margaret, maybe I'll direct this to you as a follow-up. How do we prioritize between expanding public and social housing and increasing rates of homeownership and access to wealth building, given obviously limited funding both at the federal, state, and the local levels?
I mean, I think in reality, it's like you need everything. I mean, you need all kinds of housing at every level. And, I think you really need to tackle and create opportunities for home ownership. And then you really need to help folks who are in a renting situation and in public housing, develop the resources and opportunity to make that that graduation to home ownership if that's what they want. But to do it in a way, we hope that would allow community, for you to stay within the community that you have, that you won't need to, disrupt your community and move far away from your home. But I really think it's a real function of just expanding opportunity at every level, because I think for some folks, starting with rental is the the spot where they need to be as they work and get life experience and skills to, take on, some of the requirements of home ownership.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And a great point in on that we need all sorts of housing at all levels, more of it and now, ideally. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have for questions, but thank you so much to everyone in the audience for taking the time to join us today and for your excellent questions in the chat. And of course, a special thank you to our panelists for a really terrific and rich discussion. Please fill out the survey if you have any feedback on today's event. And if you'd like to stay connected to Urban's housing justice work, I dropped a link in the chat earlier for you to subscribe. Thank you so much and have a nice day.
Thank you all.
This was great.
Bye now.